Hello everyone. In this presentation, Moses Course Part 1, we'll look at the course of Moses, how God worked with him at that time. Moses' mission was to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt out to the blessed land of Canaan. If you remember in the last presentation, we explained that when Abraham failed in the first offering, God said that 400 years would have to pass until God could work again. But gratefully, because of Jacob, as a joint effort between Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, a greater condition indemnity could be realized and a foundation for the Messiah was established. What God needs now is a national foundation to be able to receive the Messiah. And God worked with Moses at this time. Now, it's important to understand when Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, he was famous for being a dreamer. He had prophetic dreams that actually often came true. But his brothers didn't like him, and they sold him as a slave. Now he was bought by a person called Potiphar, and he used him as a slave in his household in Egypt. Now, while he was there, is a very interesting story that Joseph was the slave of the household. He was responsible for the household of Potiphar. But the wife of Potiphar was very attracted to Joseph, and she tried to seduce him many times. But Joseph was a very pure person, and he rejected her advances. But actually, the way she took it, she was rejected by a slave. She felt humiliated. And then one day, she cried out, accusing Joseph of trying to seduce her, and which was untrue. But who would people believe? Of course, Potiphar believed his wife, and Joseph was imprisoned. While he was in prison, though, he was with two other prisoners, one a baker and a servant, and another the servant of Pharaoh. Now, being in prison, they had dreams, but Joseph interpreted their dreams, one for the baker and one for the servant. But one of them, he said, you'll die in prison. You'll be executed, which actually came true. But the other one, Joseph said, you'll be freed after a period of time. And it actually came true. Now, this person overheard Pharaoh talking about the situation of the time. Pharaoh had trouble with a dream he had. But this person said, well, I know a person who is really good at interpreting dreams. And it was Joseph. So Pharaoh ordered Joseph to be taken out from prison. And Joseph interpreted the dream of Pharaoh, which was that the country would go through extreme famine for 7 years. But after this, there'd be 7 years of a great harvest. And so the Pharaoh asked Joseph, well, what can we do? He said, you need a person who can really manage this. So Pharaoh made Joseph himself the one to manage this. So in a way, Joseph was made something like the prime minister of Egypt. He was second in command only to Pharaoh himself. So it's a very interesting story. From being a slave, he was raised up to be like the prime minister. But of course, short time after this, the descendants of Joseph were put into slavery. But Joseph, he overcame the fall, the sexual temptation. And because of this, the merit of being a king or a ruler is in God's side. And for that reason, 400 years later, Moses could be in the same position. We'll see how that played out. We'll look at the birth of Moses now in Exodus 2:1-10. At that time, the Pharaoh was afraid that there's too many Israelites, and so he decided to kill all the babies of 2 years and younger. So there's incredible genocide at that time. Now Moses was born then, so he was hid in a basket and put on the riverbank. But then Pharaoh's daughter sees him there and picks him up and adopts him as her son and raises him up in the palace as a prince. But then she hires Moses' real mother to take care of him. So this is all done basically unknown to anyone else except those close to Moses. So Moses' real mother was educating Moses himself that he's a real Israelite. But yet he grew up in the palace like a prince. So the course God going through the wilderness, let's look at this situation more clearly. Moses, he was a central person with the foundation of faith. The condition he set was 40 years in the palace. You might think, well, that's not such a difficult thing, just live in a palace for 40 years. But think about it. He knew he was an Israelite. He's educated by his mother. But he sees his people suffering every day. But he has to overcome all the lustful pleasures they had in the palace. He had to keep his faith. So it's a pretty hard thing to do. Now this he did successfully, 40 years in the palace. But then the foundation of substance has to be established. But now in the national course of restoration, it's not just another individual, it's Moses himself in the able position, but the Israelites, thousands of people, are in the same position. They have to unite and follow Moses. Now Moses, as I said, he grew up as a prince. He was responsible for all the building projects. He was a taskmaster. But he saw one day an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave. So Moses felt pity for him, and he killed him. He killed the Egyptian. Why he did this is hard to know. The Bible doesn't give so many details, but if an Egyptian is beating an Israelite slave, the Israelite might have been killed. But Moses killed the Egyptian. And but the next day, Moses sees two Israelites just fighting. And Moses tries to break up the fight. But one of the Israelites says to Moses, "Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian?" So we can see that Moses' actions of killing the Egyptian was really misunderstood. And Moses realized then, if the word gets out that he killed the Egyptian, this is considered murder. Killing an Israelite slave is not a serious crime. And so Moses understood that point, that they could not unite with him. And so he fled to the wilderness of Midian. And so the first course failed. They failed to unite with Moses. Now, after 40 years, Moses was living like a shepherd in the wilderness. But after 40 years, God appears to Moses. This is recorded in Exodus 3:7-10. But God asked Moses to go back to Egypt and bring his people out from there. But actually, Moses was quite resistant because his life was in danger before. But God assured him that he would give him miracles and signs and they'll be okay. So finally Moses went back to Egypt, and by that time there's a new Pharaoh there. It would have been his half-brother at that time. And Moses, of course, is telling the Pharaoh, you have to let my people go. But of course they didn't. They laughed at him and they rejected him. They sent him away. But Moses used up all the signs and miracles, turned the sea into blood and so on. Even all the second-born sons, even the cattle were killed. At that point, Pharaoh was very frustrated. He said, just take the people and go. And so the second course, with 40 years of Moses in the wilderness, was successful. So this time that they were following Moses, he led them all out. The Egyptians pursued them, but they all died trying to cross the Red Sea. But only the Israelites crossed the sea in dry land. So it's a success. But the problem with this is that actually they're on their way to the promised land, but God is concerned that they might lose faith again on the journey, because they need to keep faith in Moses, not just temporarily. They need to keep faith in Moses all the way until they reach the promised land, and then build the temple and be established there. And of course, if they lost faith, again, the whole thing would be lost. So therefore, God needed to create a symbolic object of faith, that even if all the Israelites lost faith, if even just one person kept faith in this, God could continue working with that person. And that symbolic object of faith was going to be the tabernacle. And for the symbolic object of faith, there needs to be a foundation of faith and substance for that. That's why God called Moses on Mount Sinai, and he fasted 40 days, and then he received the tablets of stone and directions for building the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and so on. Now, when he was on his way down, he noticed that the Israelites, they built a golden calf. So they lost faith when he was there. They lost faith in Moses. So Moses was very angry, and he broke the tablets of stone and threw them down. But then God called Moses up again to fast another 40 days. By this time, they kept faith in Moses in those 40 days. And so the foundation and substance for the tabernacle was successful. So the significance of these is, for example, the 1 Corinthians 10:4 said the rock was Christ. Revelations 2:17, Christ is a white stone. So 2 tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments, God's words written on them, symbolize the restored Adam and restored Eve. Tabernacle is like a moving temple. And we know the temple, Jesus himself likened himself to the temple. In John 2:21, he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. 1 Corinthians 3:16 states, a believer is a temple of God. So the main temple would be Christ. So therefore, the tabernacle or the temple are a symbolic Messiah. So they needed a symbolic Messiah to keep faith in symbolic Messiah until they realized the foundation of substance, faith and substance for the real Messiah. So that's why that was so important, the tabernacle and the 10 Commandments, 2 tablets of stone, on their way through the wilderness to the promised land. So we'll continue with this presentation. In the next presentation, while they're in the wilderness, travelling toward the promised land, and we'll continue in part 2 of Moses' course. Thank you very much.